Hello guys and welcome to a new video. So in this video we're gonna start talking about arrays, which is actually chapter 6 in the textbook, and that's gonna be the last chapter we're gonna talk about in this class. So what are arrays and why do we need them? First thing first, you need to know that arrays are so-called data structures. So what are data structures? Data structures are kind of like blocks that allow us to store data, kind of similar to variables, but they are way more efficient than variables. So let me explain. So far, we have looked into variables and we know we can store variables or store values inside of variables. But that's not always efficient. So imagine I have a class of 20 students and then I'm trying to store the grades for different students. The way we would do so far is like int grade, like 1 for student 1, let's say that's like 100, int grade 2, it's going to be like 50, etc. So essentially I will have 20 lines that look like this one. So obviously, first of all, my program is going to look really, really long. The other thing is, what if after I enter the grades, I decide I'm gonna do a curve, and then I'm gonna, give everybody extra 5 points. How would I do that? Am I gonna go through the whole 20 variables that I have and individually add, 5 points for each? So it's not really efficient, and again, your program is gonna look really, really long. So arrays are the solution for this. So obviously arrays are essentially kind of like you will have one variable, okay? So this variable is going to be your reference. And then inside of this variable, it's going to be divided into so-called like cells. And then in each cell, you're going to store, a value. So essentially it's going to be like whole sequence of values stored in some type of like sequential fashion, and then in each element it would have its own value. So it's going to be really efficient for storing values, retrieving values, and then we will be able to use like for loops in order to iterate through each cell in the array so that we can do any kind of thing we want. So for example, if I want to give 5 extra points for each student now with arrays, it's just going to be a couple lines and I'm going to be done. So it's a lot more efficient. So how, kind of like now we started with arrays are data structures. So essentially they allow us to store data that pretty much kind of it's going to be in the same data type. So the values, they have to have exactly the same data type, which is actually called like homogeneous data. Homogeneous. I don't know if that's the spelling, but you get the point. So now, how do we actually define arrays? So to define an array, the structure that you're going to follow is it's just going to be data type, because remember these are homogeneous data. So the type and then square bracket, and then you would give an array name and then equal. There are actually a couple ways. Let's start with the kind of like easier way. It's going to be square bracket and then some values that actually belong to that data type. So for instance, I can put like val1, val2, etc. So yeah, it's just doing autocomplete thing. Okay, so val3, and you get the point. So you can actually go up to whatever number of values. So for example, if I say I'm going to store the grades, it's just going to be an integer. And remember, you need to tell the compiler that this is an array. And the way you would do that is with square brackets. So it's just going to be grade, that's going to be the name. And then if you don't like grades, and then you just put the grade. So let's say like 100, 90, 80, and then go back 95, for instance. So now I essentially stored four different values. What initially I would actually need four variables, four separate variables for. I can actually do this in just one line with one variable, grades. And I'm telling the compiler grades is an array that is storing integers. You see over here all the values that I'm storing are actually integers. If I change something like 100.5, notice I got an error because it expects all the values to be as of data type integer. So now actually I can comment this one. Now, how would I tell the compiler that I'm trying to access this cell or this cell or that cell or the last cell? There is something called an index, and the index actually represents a number which kind of uh, says the order at which this cell appears in the array. That represents the cell in the array. So in this case, the index for the first value is always at 0. That's the Java way of actually specifying the index. And then the next one is just going to be 1, 2, and 3. So this array has a length of 4, but it goes from 0, 1, 2, and 3. So now, how would I access, like for instance, the first one? Let me do an S out, and then the first cell value is, this one is just going to be grades, and that's how would I get the 100, and then square bracket. Again, square brackets always refer to arrays, just like parentheses, normally they represent methods, and then you would provide the index. In this case, the index is 0. So now if I run the program, you get 100. And then if I do the second one, it's just going to be grades of 1. Then you're going to actually see 90. What happens if I try to actually accidentally put like 10? There's actually no index 10 because our array length is actually 4. So the highest we can go for is 3, not 10. If I run this, notice we actually got an exception. That's error because our array length is only 4 and 10 is out of bounds. So we get this error. So notice again, this is what you really need to know so far about arrays. It's sequence of values that are all of the same data type, and this is the easy way to create an arrays. But also there is another way you can actually create arrays, which is like the more efficient and the more like common way in your program, because normally, like let's say like the class average example we did in class, essentially it doesn't give you the ability to kind of look at what the user typed in. You can only get the average. But what if I say I want to store those values? Well, obviously the array is the way to go. So we're going to look into the second way, and that's the most important way to define arrays. But before we do that, let me just actually now define different arrays. So let's say I have double, again, square brackets for array. So type square brackets and then give a name. So grades D for double, and then square brackets like let's say 100.5, 90.3, 80.5, and then now I'm just gonna also say 95.6, for instance. I mean, you can put any values, any length, it just doesn't matter. This is just a way for you to look at how we can define arrays. And finally, I will define one last array that's going to be a char array. So I'm only going to be storing characters in it. So grade C, let's say A, B, C, and D. And notice it's pretty much, that's another array. So now if I just copy this, and then notice this really doesn't matter in terms of the index. So the index is always 0, 1, 2, and 3. So now if I do grades C of 0, or grade C of 0, not grades, we call it grade. So now I'm just gonna actually comment these. So now you should be able to see A, and then again it really doesn't matter, and the same thing for this one. So you have to know the index is just a number inside of the array that represents the order of that cell in that array, and it always starts with 0. Okay, just like a string. Each character in the string, like the first character, pretty much has the index 0, and then it goes all the way up, and we have a similar thing here in the array. Okay, so last thing I'm just going to talk about in this video is another way to define an array, and that's going to be something like very similar to this one. So I'm just going to copy that. So another way to define arrays is just going to be type name, and then you would have the keyword new, and then type. So it's going to be exactly the same type, and then size of the array. So for instance, if I have int, it's just going to be, let's call it grades new, or grade new. It's just going to be new. Actually, to make it less confusing, it's actually my grade. It's just going to be, so my grades is the name now. And then in new is actually a reserved word in Java, just like for loop, just like for while, if, and all that. So new int, it has to match, and then it's just going to be the size. Let's say it's just going to be of size 4 or 5, any number. So now I defined an array now called my grades, and by default, by the way, Java for integer arrays, once it defined that array, um, integer array elements all have the value 0. That's how Java does it. So if I actually take this print line statement, copy it, and then it's just going to be my grades 0. It's just going to be 0. So actually, let me comment this too. And you're going to see now the first cell is 0. And if I actually do 1, again, 1 is also going to be 0, and things like that. So that's how it is done. And if it was double array, it's just going to be double, and then my grades D. Notice I'm using this name, but you can name it anything you want. It doesn't really matter. And then the size 4, and then for car, it's just going to be my grades C. It's just going to be new my grades or a new integer. I'm sorry, new int of or car of 4. And then it also can be something like string my grades string. It's just going to be new string 4 if you actually want to store like an array of string. So now one thing I guys want you to do is, for integer arrays, the default values once you actually create the array is 0. Try to print the values for character arrays, string arrays, see what the default value is. So that's something I guys want you to try. Okay, so in our next video we're gonna look more closely into arrays and see how we can use like for loop and other things we have learned in order to um, work further with arrays and see the kind of things we want to do. Also, I want you guys to look into the slide, and this kind of shows you the kind of things you can do in the arrays, and hopefully that's going to make things very clear to you. Okay, so have a good one, guys, and I'll see you in the next video. Bye bye.